Hi there, welcome to Regulate Tech. This is episode 18 with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, in a small cabin on an island in the archipelago. But I'm, as usual, outdone by
Richard Allan, and I am in a churchyard somewhere in Gloucestershire on a walk. So if you hear crows in the background or me greeting dog walkers, please forgive us for this one episode.
I think this is added value rather than anything else. So we had talked before and referred to the issue of online child safety and said that this is something that we want to get back to, and it's a vast issue. But at the heart of this issue is this notion that the internet is an environment that is not entirely friendly to children, and where there are safety issues, and those safety issues, they have to be understood, categorized. They have to be sort of deeply researched and explored. And then what you do is that you try to find one thing, which is like a limiting threshold, age, where you say, at what age should you be able to access the internet? And the other thing is, and who should be responsible for what on the internet when it comes to kids. So I think I would love to start asking you about the first question. How do we think about age limits on the internet? And how should we build those?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I find this so interesting is that we should be really candid. We've essentially created a system in which people are incentivized to lie. And they lie at massive scale about their age, and I don't mean that sort of, like I say, I don't mean that negatively, but they will put in the wrong age because they want access to the services, and in a lot of cases that's the young people themselves, the people who are under whatever the relevant age is for the service, and we can get into the details. Sometimes it's 16, sometimes it's 13. So I'm not talking about people accessing necessarily pornographic sites at the age of 18, but we're just talking about bog standard internet services. That's search, social media, etc. So people are lying at massive scale, and any of the surveys that are done by regulators, Ofcom for example, the UK communications regulator, looks at this and it kind of goes 80% or whatever. I haven't got the figures in front of me, but massive numbers of 11 and 12-year-olds are on all of the mainstream social media services, and the only way they could have got there would have been to lie about their age. And in many cases, they're doing it entirely with the support of their parents. I mean, or at least their parents are not objecting to them doing this. They know they're doing it and they're not objecting. So this is, for me, is sort of fundamental. We've got ourselves into a situation where the legislation often tends to try and ratchet up the requirements to prove you are the age that you say you are. At the same time, people's behavior, young people and their parents, are kind of going, yeah, we don't really care about those limits. If we want to access the services, we'll do it. And if we have to put in a false age, we'll just put in a false age.
And so let's talk about that, because that's kind of extraordinary. What you're saying is that we have legislation that almost everyone ignores, that is out there to protect children, though. That's the purpose. What is the disconnect here? Because, I mean, I can phrase it differently. Why do we have this legislation if, with the famous words of Dr. House, everyone lies?
Yeah, I mean, it's done with good intention. But again, if you track the EU's legislation, let's just sort of stick to that for the moment, the General Data Protection Regulation, it went through about 3 years of debate, during which it said that the minimum age at which you can collect people's data and process it without their parents' consent is 13. And pretty much everyone thought, well, that's kind of reasonable. We can talk about the 11 and 12-year-olds, but, the 13, 14, 15-year-olds are sort of covered by that. Then at the very last minute, the proposal changed, and it said 16 is now the minimum age limit. And it gave the opportunity for countries to what they call derogate, posh word, but deviate from that if they wanted to. But essentially it was raised to 16. I remember at the time kind of going, where did this come from? And no one would admit to doing it. So you ask the British people in Brussels and they said, oh, it's the French who insist on it. You ask the French, they go, no, it's the British. And you're just going round and round in circles and no one would claim ownership. But at some point they said, let's move it to 16. And I think, frankly, it's what in other areas we call sort of virtue signaling. We care about children, and if there's a proposal, one is 13 and the other is 16, then the 16 one sounds more protective, therefore we'll say 16.
Yeah, so you care more about someone if you sort of have a higher...
And you have the higher age limit, yeah.
Yeah,
ignoring the fact that you're just creating a much bigger category of liars by going to 16, and doing it at the last minute without proper debate or discussion.
yeah, and at the heart of this is also the question of why this is an item for legislation. Because in most cases, I determine when my kids get to see certain movies. For example, we do have age limits on movies, but they are largely also ignored, by the way. And I think it's sort of there is something here about the parent vis-a-vis the legislator, and how we balance this is why is the legislator interested in setting an age limit when we know, for example, that if you look at two 13-year-olds, the maturity levels can be widely different. You can have somebody who's sort of 14, 15, somebody who's perhaps a little bit more towards 11, 10, because the age is not the single best indicator of maturity.
Yeah, so I mean, philosophically, there are quite different sort of traditions involved here. So some of the traditions are very much focused on parental rights, and I'd argue, in some sense, the US law generally is focused in that direction. Parents get to decide what's right for their kids. And then there's a sort of other notion, which is encapsulated in things like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's encapsulated actually UK law in something called the Children's Act, where children have their own independent rights, distinct from the rights of their parents. And actually in that latter group sort of contend in both directions. One is it can sort of drive you towards saying, well, children have the right to access things like internet services. And I actually had an encounter with, perhaps not surprisingly, a Scandinavian government representative who was sort of outraged that Facebook was setting a lower age limit, because if children in that country, wanted to express themselves through the platform, they literally had a right to express themselves through the platform. But the flip side of that is it also says, look, if children have got these independent rights to access services, they equally have a right to be protected when they access those services. A classic sort of human rights framework. So I think we've got those two traditions. There's one which sort of arguably is more, I almost say it's almost religious. It's almost that sort of notion of the parent decides for the child. And at the most extreme end, that would say things like, if the parent, for religious reasons, doesn't want the child to have a blood transfusion, they have a right to decline a blood transfusion, or they have a right to educate their child out of school in a commune or whatever it is. And, and there are examples that we can see, particularly sort of strongly represented in the US. And then there's this other tradition which says, no, children have independent rights. Sometimes parents are not good, and the children's rights need to be seen as actually more important than the parents' rights. They override it. If the child needs a blood transfusion, don't care what the parents think, the child's going to get the blood transfusion, and a judge can decide to do that. And I say within that tradition, which I think is strongly represented in the European debate, you also have this strong notion that the child has this right both to use the service and to use it safely.
And the right to use the service, and use it safely, I think it sounds good. I mean, there's this, as you say, if you trace this back historically, it's almost children-like property vis-a-vis children-like individuals. That's sort of how this played out many 100 years ago. And what you sort of want to do here, I think, is that you want to say that second perspective, where children have individual rights and those rights sometimes can supervene those of the parents, seems to be the rational and to some extent the sane one, to really respect the rights of children. But if you do that, then who? Because that's not what gets you to an age limit. If that was what you did, you wouldn't get to an age limit with that model. So where does the age limit come from?
So again, like candidly, I think quite a lot of it is, as we've discussed many times, there is a significant number of people who are very active in the policy scene who think fundamentally that particularly advertising-driven large-scale internet services are bad, evil, whatever language you want to use, and it's under this banner of surveillance capitalism. And so I think there's a lot of people who come from that starting point, and if this stuff is bad for everyone, it is particularly bad for kids. And so they want to keep the kids off. They do explicitly, I think, want children not to be using mainstream internet services. And actually, in their ideal world, I think they'd want the mainstream internet services to change altogether. And to a certain extent, I think the children issue or the teenager issue becomes a wedge for that. So you can say, look, we are going to insist that you don't do things like targeted advertising for children. really because we'd like you not to do targeting advertising for anyone, and we're going to kind of use this as a wedge issue to drive that. We think you need to get much more robust consents for the use of data for everyone, but particularly for children. So it's a kind of extension, I think, for a lot of people of a general view that this surveillance capitalism, for want of a better word, is a bad thing, and that people need to be protected from it, and children especially need to be protected from it. I think that's very much where the age limits come from.
Yes, and it's interesting because you have the age limits in Europe, but then of course one of the most normative age limits, the age of 13, is from COPPA, the Children Online Privacy Protection Act in the US, where this sort of this is an early piece of legislation, where I think there was the same kind of argument. You thought that okay, this is a new environment. It can potentially be threatening, and sure, there are real threats there, and so we need to set an age limit, and that then ended up with that age limit of 13, which sort of meant that in the TOS of almost every social media company, the TOS terms of service. Yes, thank you. Yes, that those terms uniformly said you cannot be on this service if you are under the age of 13. And so every social media executive, when asked, would say, there are no children under 13 on my service, because if they are in breach of contract, in breach of the terms of service. And that creates yet another kind of lying, in a sense, because if you look at this, of course, that there's some portion of the people using your service who are going to be under 13. But you've tried to make sure that doesn't happen through the only means you have available to you, the terms of service, or at least sort of the first level means you have available to you. So how do we deal with this?
Yeah, I mean, COPPA, in a sense, created this sort of original sin for these models where ignorance is bliss. So essentially it said it incentivized not knowing. So what it said is, as long as you don't know that they're under 13-year-olds, you're fine. And so you can get on, and actually in a world in which, the kids are happily identifying themselves as over 13, even if they're not, and the parents are happily allowing them to do so, it kind of works pretty well because you haven't got a problem. You just need to deal with those situations where somebody does tell you explicitly that somebody is under 13. And in those cases, you need to actually make sure that account is closed down. And actually, American internet companies are, by and large, pretty good at that. Once they've had sort of explicit information to say somebody's under 13, they'll get rid of the account. But that doesn't mean that they haven't got under 13-year-olds on their services, and it doesn't necessarily incentivize the services to deal with the under 13-year-olds. And I think that's probably my biggest criticism of these models that rely on these age limits, is that if you're saying to a company, look, ignorance is bliss. As long as you don't know they're underage, you're fine. And as long as you've got a system somewhere that says, if somebody reports it, you deal with it. What you're actually doing is saying, at the same time, make sure you don't suspect that somebody is underage, or don't sort of notify yourself that somebody is underage if you suspect that. And that does mean I've been in these discussions where, nowadays with AI, and again, Nicklas, you've talked a lot about it, with more information, you can actually do good things with AI. And one of the good uses of AI is that it's perfectly straightforward, I actually think now, for most of the large platforms with a reasonably high degree of accuracy to categorize their users by age. There's all sorts of signals that they give off. It can be their cultural tastes. It can be, AI on image recognition, looking at the kind of images that they're sharing, all of that stuff. And so they could categorize people and go, actually, we've identified the cohort of 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds. But they won't. And the reason they won't do it is because by doing that, they create this massive legal risk for themselves. And so I would love a system in which I actually think it's in the child's interest. Look, if they're going to be on there, and we can talk a little bit more about whether they should be on there, but assuming they're going to be on there, I think it's much safer for an internet platform to use its clever AI technology to identify the 11 and 12-year-olds and create special safeguards. Even if they've said they're 18, you can treat them as though they're 11-year-olds. For example, very concretely, you might say in your reporting system, if I get a report from this category of user, somebody who I think is a younger user, goes to the top of the queue. going to get dealt with in 15 minutes. And maybe your normal turnaround time is 24 hours. But for these group, 15 minutes. If it's a bullying report, take it more seriously. If it's a report to do with inappropriate sexual contact, absolutely. Top of the list, deal with that in 3 minutes. But you can't do that unless your internal systems have been able to classify the user as an 11 or 12-year-old. And at the moment, you're hugely disincentivized from doing that classification, because if you do, you potentially run risk of both COPPA in the US and now the GDPR in the EU.
Yes. And this is so interesting, because with this kind of age inferral, you could also see if somebody who was at a much advanced age was trying to reach out to younger users of the service. So you could catch grooming, you could catch all kinds of different things that we really want to catch and want to make sure that we stop. So let's talk a little bit about the question that you just mentioned of whether or not they should be on the services. And let's add to that question something else. I mean, one response to this that more and more services are exploring is to say, okay, we'll set up a walled garden that it's just going to be for the up to 13-year-olds, sort of a kids garden. And they can play in that garden until they turn 13. And when they turn 13, we will sort of graduate their account into a grown-ups or sort of a regular account. This comes with several, I think, problems. One of them, of course, is that most kids wouldn't be caught dead in the kids version of the app because they really believe that that's for kids and they're not kids, because most kids don't think they're kids, at least at a certain age. And so,
and many adults do think they're kids.
That's very true. Yes. and then the other problem it creates is that then you have this sort of really vulnerable identified cohort of kids for different kinds of safety reasons, pointing out that they are kids within this system actually creates an additional risk. So should they be on the services? Should they be on kids versions of the services? How should we, if we sort of were just doing this from first principles and we were thinking about the safety of the child first, where would we go?
I mean, the first principle is to look at, when are parents giving their children internet-connected mobile phones or internet-enabled mobile phones? That's the first choice. When do we as a society think that it's appropriate for our children to have an internet-enabled device in their pocket? And for many of us, I mean, certainly I think in the UK, it's very typically associated with going to secondary school. It's age 11, and quite often before, frankly. So there'll be a period, I think, when kids are sort of 5, 6, 7. I actually think it's quite helpful to break it down into these age groups. Sort of 5, 6, 7 is going to be much more using your parents' phone. 8, 9, 10, some families will certainly be giving their children their own phones at that age. And 11 plus, absolutely. And when your kid goes to secondary school, not least because you've got to organize stuff, like when are you leaving school? If you're going on a school, I mean, my kids, it was like when they first went on a school trip. You can't send kids on a school trip. Well, you can do, but nowadays nobody would think it was safe to send kids on a school trip without having some ability to communicate with them. And certainly in the UK, the standard thing is WhatsApp, which you're not supposed to be on until you're 16. But hey, I would rather my child on a school trip is breaking WhatsApp's terms of service than being in danger because I've got no way of getting hold of them and the teacher's got no way of getting hold of them. So 11, I think, is the standard age. So the first thing is, like, what age do they get the internet-enabled device? And then the second question really then is, yes, at what age are different services going to be appropriate for them? And messaging is an obvious baseline one. Again, for some people, maybe controversial, but I find it hard to sort of imagine why you would have a connected device without messaging these days. But then there's things obviously like social media services, perhaps much more controversial because that creates this sort of lasting, potentially public record of what they're doing. Other services I find interesting, like mapping. Again, I think it's much safer for a child at a really young age to learn how to use a mapping service. And if they use a popular mapping service developed by your former employer, Nicklas, it does involve a certain amount of collection of personal data. It's just sort of built into the product.
Yep.
And if you have a rule that says you can't collect the data of under 16-year-olds, it's going to be a real challenge when they take on a mapping service. Again, personally think that's sort of fine, but I think that's where we need to have the debate. It would be logical to have a law that says, look, children under 16 cannot have smartphones. They must have the old Nokia phones with no internet connection. That would be logical, but of course, completely unrealistic. Okay, that's not going to happen. So at what age are people getting those devices? and then what are the right kind of service to have at which age, and then what do we expect of the service providers for those ages. And you're right, in some cases it may be a dedicated specific product. There'll certainly be products for like, the 5, 6, 7, 8-year age group, which are only kid focused, sort of Lego type products that are actually quite good for that age group, and Minecraft type products. And then there'll be another set of ones which could be used by children or adults. And perhaps that's the more controversial area where you start to get into messaging services and some of the social media services.
So let me play devil's advocate for a bit. I mean, we have another kind of technology where we think it's very natural to have an 18 or 21 year old limit, and where we actually force people to take a test before they can use it, and that's cars.
Yes.
Right. So when it comes to cars, we find that it's dangerous for people if they run them, and it's dangerous for other people if they run them, unless they have the right age and they have gone through the test and they get their license. So why shouldn't we apply the car metaphor or car analogy to the internet?
Again, as a society, I think we could do that, and actually think just from a pure regulatory point of view, there is a regulatory logic. If you think it is so dangerous, that's exactly what you should do. And again, I always come back to my famous cookie directive as an example. But sometimes you're not regulating for the thing you want to regulate. The cookie directive was saying we want to ban targeted advertising. It ended up sort of regulating cookies. Some people do want to ban the internet. I think it's a dangerous thing per se for younger kids. And if they do, that should be put on the table, not to kind of regulate for things that sort of work around that. So first thing first, as a regulatory debate, let's have the debate. How many of us think that the internet per se is dangerous for kids at different ages? To take your car analogy, is it 11, 13, 16? And if they do, we can have that debate. But if we then decide, no, it's not like a car, it's like a scooter, push scooters. So it's a scooter or even an electric scooter, actually. That maybe is a much more interesting analogy. And we are having some of those debates. Should you have to have some kind of license to ride an electric scooter? And you see kids of all ages riding them. So let's sort of, is it more like the electric scooter? In which case, what's the right kind of thing, which is going to be short of a formal ban and driving test, but maybe more than nothing. So what's the thing that we need to put in place for different age brackets? But realistically, again, I think the ban is unrealistic, but I think it has to be debated. And then once we've ruled it out, we then move on to say, well, what is realistic?
I think, and the point of that, I think, is that if you really force yourself to reason through why it's not like a car or more like a scooter, or why we shouldn't have a license or an internet license, then you realize that all of the things that come with that, an age limit, the test, all of those kinds of responsibility and liability rules that come with it, they should be applied only to that paradigm case. So you then need to look for other solutions. What we have now is sort of not a pure solution, but a mixed solution where there are echoes of the car thinking, echoes of the scooter thinking, and a mix of them, which creates this weirdness where you get, as you pointed out, massive lying. And so it seems as if mixed metaphors always get you, right? And in this case, it's a mixed metaphor problem to a certain extent, where we're saying the internet is like a car or it's like a scooter, and it's a little bit of both. And we take the age limit from licenses and driving, and then we take the parental responsibility from scooters, and we just mix it. And that makes for, you could argue that makes for poor legislation, because the mixed metaphors then create this secondhand effect. But what now is happening is that we're stuck with this mixed metaphor legislation, with age limits and with this current structure. And that means that we're also building on it. And one of the things we're building, one of the things that we're discussing now in a lot of different places, is this notion of mandatory age verification.
Sorry.
So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, we just, again, need to be realistic about what we're talking about. Sometimes there's a perception that age verification is something that kids would have to do. And again, we just need to be really clear that mandatory age verification means everybody, because you can't tell that they're kids unless you've eliminated all the ones who are not kids. And so this basically means us moving to a position where to sign up for internet services, you have to produce some form of ID, official ID, with your age on it. And that's not the kids, that is every single one of us. And again, I can see why people will make that argument, but I think the argument is more broader than the kids one, and the kids part is, again, a wedge to drive through or to respond to a concern that people anyway have, which is anonymity on the internet. And there's a lot of people are concerned about that for all sorts of reasons, and often valid. So in the UK at the moment, there's a very sort of fierce debate going on about racism in sport, where when particularly black football players post things, they get a torrent of racist abuse in response on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. And so part of the response to that has been to say, well, if we had mandatory identification of people, that might deal with that. So there is a constituency for mandatory ID verification for everybody to answer a whole range of concerns. And I think the child debate is part of that. But we should be having the debate at that level. What we shouldn't be thinking is, well, we can have a system within which only the children have to prove their age, or rather prove their identity, and not everybody else. There are some systems, to be fair, where people have said, look, we can try and get you to prove your age without storing your ID. So that would be answering a slightly different problem. But again, those are, in all cases, it does mean adding extra friction. Because again, if I wanted to avoid having the control, where I had to pass particular barriers because I was a child, I need to prove I'm not a child. So you've got things that you want children to do, but the entire population of internet users gets pulled into this because they've got to prove they're not children in order to not be subject to whatever controls are being put in place.
These are the second, third order effects of the mixed metaphor legislation you get, because at that point we're discussing de-anonymization of the entire internet. And I think you pointed out sometime when we were sitting beside each other in a hearing, this doesn't necessarily make people nicer. In fact, they're quite comfortable with being not so nice under their own name as well. So it seems to me that you're then not solving for that problem as well. But let's get back to the question of age verification, because doesn't that also create the additional problem of sort of having a widely dispersed database of kids, essentially? Because you could argue you throw away, if you're sort of above the age of something, then you throw away the identification and you don't store it. But you have to store it for the children in order to make sure that you did the age verification. What you have created now is that you have a set of databases of kids who are using different services spread out across different services. And I think for the large platforms, that's fine because they have great security routines. They have really robust systems. But this would happen for every new service that came up as well. So everyone would have to collect information on kids. And the end result then would seem to be, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, that you would have 10x more data on kids collected about what they're doing than you have today.
There's a number. Yeah. Well, there are a number of different models. I mean, some of them would sort of just have a token, and somebody issues a token somewhere. So, the crudest methods are there today, where, for example, you might be asked to put in credit card information to prove you're 18, and that's for the people to prove they're over age. And then, having put the credit card information in theory, you could throw away. You don't need to retain your personal device. You just got a token saying this person. Well, it doesn't say they're over 18. It says this person was able to use a credit card at the moment at which they carried out the transaction, which we assume means they're over 18. And there are sort of similar models where people talk about, whether it's government or others, would issue a token that a child could use to say, look, I'm 15 or 16. And so that token, in theory, is anonymous and safe, and therefore could be reasonably well distributed. But I actually would have a genuine concern that, again, for those who are concerned about the dominance of the big platforms, look, it seems to me like pretty common sense that in a world in which signing up to internet services involves more friction and more disclosure of personal data, you are likely to tend towards well-known established services. That just seems a reasonable thing that, whatever I feel about Facebook and Google and others, look, if they ask me for my government ID, may not like it, but I think they're probably going to keep it secure, and they've got a reputation and they've got shareholders, If it's like other internet service, I'm an app you've just downloaded from the web, and now I'm asking you for your government ID, I'm like, no, I'm not going to go there. So I think, again, there are these second and third order effects that once you get into requesting much more information at sign-up time, in whatever form and for whatever purpose, it will potentially have a concentrating effect, where people will concentrate around those services where they've got more confidence, or just the services they already use. I mean, giving additional information to service you already use is different from giving sensitive identifying information to another service. As I say, again, to be candid, the proponents of some of the systems will say, look, we can do it with tokens that are throwaway, low risk, etc., etc. But again, you have to ask, if they how long that would last, because if those tokens are sort of so low risk and involve so little transfer of data, how long before people say, well, the token's insufficient and we need something else as well, and then you're back sort of ratcheting up, demanding more and more data.
Yes, and so, but now we have explained why the current system is so bad. We have sort of gone through and talked about why we think it creates effects that are not great. And so I think it's really, probably healthy for us to also admit that there is a real online safety problem for kids. There are threats, there are risks. So let's just talk a little bit about that and what we think should be done about those risks.
Yeah.
What are the ways in which we can make kids safer online?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things you can do at the back end, but just starting at the front end, my ideal solution, and I'll come back to iOS and Android again, repeated theme, but my ideal solution would be, as a parent, when I buy my child their first phone, and it's nearly always going to be a transaction between a parent and a child, that I get the Android phone or the iOS phone. And what happens today is I lie and I set it up as though it's potentially me or an over 16 account. In some cases, I'm very virtuous and I figure out how to get through the child thingy in order to set it up. Because to be fair, Apple and Google have created these sort of child specific versions, but often people get frustrated when they install them. But I would like to be able to set it up. Absolutely honestly, I'd like to be able to say, this phone belongs to an 11-year-old. And then I'd like to set a set of rules, and those rules will vary by parent. And those rules would be, for me as a parent, I'm happy with the child potentially accessing all apps or apps, but not these kind of apps or whatever it is. But I'm going to set a set of rules. And again, some of the kid services do that today.
How much leeway should you have there? Should you be able to say the kid should be able to use all apps, or should the legislation be such that you can not allow the kid to trade in crypto on Coinbase? Or are there should there be limits, or should it be up to the parents?
Again, I think we need to have that discussion in detail about different kinds of apps. There are some apps where for sort of regulatory reasons, you're right, trading in crypto, probably illegal anyway. And there will be some apps that are sort of age limited for other reasons. But something like messaging services, for example, messaging services, I think pretty much should be up to the parent which messaging service they want to use with their kids.
And there are app ratings, right? So you could essentially say that you're able to set up some of the app ratings. But let's get back to app ratings, because I see you making a face.
So, and the app ratings are weird because they're not sort of based. They're based on, I think, some odd notions at the moment. Anyway, so I think you set it up. You say it's an 11-year-old. I say, I'm okay with them using messaging services, and this is the one I want them to use. It's my messaging service. Don't want it to have a lower age limit. I'll make a decision about things like social media, etc. So that'll work. And then some people will listen to this and go, "Oh, that's fine," but you're like super educated in tech stuff, and you know what you're doing. And for a lot of parents, it's much more of a mystery. So the second part of this, which I think is equally important, is that again, if the services know that the user is 11. Either because they've queried the phone or because they've used clever AI, whatever the permissions that the parents given, the services should be doing all sorts of stuff to meet their duty of care. That's the common language we're talking about. There should be, I've talked about these things, harm reduction plans. They should identify where are the areas of harm for 11-year-olds on their service. Do they have a problem with grooming? Do they have a problem with inappropriate distribution of pornography, et cetera, et cetera? And then the service should implement all sorts of back-end measures that then tailor the service for their assumed age of the user, either known age, because the person did correctly enter it in the phone and they know that's an 11-year-old, but they've not had to kick them off or pretend they're not an 11-year-old. They've allowed them on there as long as it's not a legally age-restricted service. They've allowed them on, and now they've tailored their service for that 11-year-old based on a knowledge of the particular risk on their platform and a discussion with the regulator and child safety experts about what needs to be done.
But
it's got to be that very open conversation, knowing you've got 11-year-olds on there, not just pretending they're not there, or, you somehow magic them away.
So that means that you get a much more robust first situation where you're able to set up your phone as a child's account that's linked to your parent's account, and you can sort of set all kinds of rules for that, and you can discuss what kinds of rules you should be able to set and what kinds of rules sort of should be mandatory for a child's account, and you can have that discussion. And then when you get to the back end, it's kind of interesting because you can infer that someone is a child, which might be horribly insulting if you're not, but you can sort of infer that somebody is a child, and then you can start to put all of those protective measures in place for those who are not as digitally literate as others and find it hard to configure, etc. So we leave no child behind, as that's George W. Bush would have said. I think that the question that then comes up is on the back end. There's some specific cases. The most well-known, I think, is child sexual abuse imageries, where there is proactive scanning and filtering for criminal images that many of the large services engage in, and then report in to specific institutions like NICMEC or the Internet Watch Foundation, etc. And there's proactive policing of that. That's sort of universally agreed it's a good thing. Should that proactive policing be extended to things like grooming? Should we be extending it to other things that threaten children in order to make sure that we really deal with their online safety? Where does the line for proactive policing go when it comes to this?
So there's been a really interesting discussion actually in the European Parliament on this recently, which I've written about at regulate.tech, but and there's a guy called John Carr, who's an expert in the UK, who's written about this a lot. And it's actually really challenging because certainly at the European level, there is a strong political desire to deal with things like grooming. And I certainly, when I was at Facebook, had massive pressure from police officers to say, look, you know this stuff is happening. You could spot it. If you don't try and spot it, you are neglectful of your duty of care. If there's something you could have done you didn't do, that's a failure. And we were hugely pressurized to do more to try and identify grooming activity. At the same time, there's no doubt it involves quite privacy intrusive techniques. And the way that you have to do it is you would filter down, you'd say, what's the age gap between two people who are communicating? If I see that pattern of messages, I'm going to start scanning the messages for sexual terms, invitations to meet, all that kind of stuff. Hugely intrusive. We wouldn't normally feel very comfortable with having private messages scanned. But in this case, I think a lot of people would think it's justified. European Parliament's really been struggling with this, and they've sort of seen this stuff going on. They don't want to stop it because it's it sounds terrible not to be trying to catch child abuse. At the same time, the logic of privacy rules suggests it really shouldn't be happening. You should only do the intrusion once the bad thing has happened. Of course, that's a real problem for anything preventive. If it's preventive, you've got to do the intrusion beforehand. I even know people are uncomfortable about scanning of images for child sexual abuse because they'll say, look, you should only scan the child sexual abuse images, not all the others, the innocent ones.
How do you do that?
Yeah. But I mean, that's the logic of it. So they're really struggling with it. And again, I think this is an area where we really need to have a much more open debate. It'll happen over terrorism as well, where society has a view. Society wants both privacy and security. And ultimately, we're going to come to a point where we settle on where we are, balancing those two interests off against each other. A world of absolute privacy, we're not going to look at the private messages of those child abusers or potential child abusers. A world of absolute security, we're going to be reading everybody's messages all of the time, and that's open to abuse. Somewhere in between, there's a set of rules, an algorithm that says under these circumstances, it is okay to do the scanning. And this is the kind of scanning we could do. And that's where the European Parliament is trying to get to, but it's still not fully resolved. I think they created a sort of extension of an opt-out from privacy rules for this kind of activity for a period of time. But as I say, I think the public could have this debate actually quite easily. I think it's actually in some ways it's more of a struggle for politicians who have to sound either, I'm all for privacy or I'm all for protecting kids. And most of the politicians I come across sort of tend to be in one of those camps. Much harder to get to the place where you go, this is enough privacy and enough protection. Oof. That's a difficult thing to say.
If you put the question to the sort of proverbial man or woman on the street, I think the result would be fairly simple, wouldn't it? I mean, most people would say, if you can find people who are engaged in grooming, I'm fine with you reading a few of my messages. That's sort of where I think most people will go with their own analysis. So I think it's really interesting that what you're saying, that politicians are struggling more with this than we would in an open public debate. I think that's very true for a fair bit of the stuff that we've been discussing on online child safety. I think the more people would like for platforms to take an active responsibility in policing this, and that's sort of just a general emotion, a feeling, and they don't necessarily think about what that means, because I think the other thing that we haven't mentioned that doesn't have to do with privacy or preventive criminal detection is the fact that you would then be privatizing a huge piece of what the state has traditionally done, which is policing. That would then be something that, this would be evidence in court, that stuff that you found on the platform that was generated by the algorithms by these companies. And so it's a delegation of policing power, if you will, that would be unparalleled. And that, I think, is something that usually, again, a second order effect that's usually not discussed as much.
No, and again, you're right, and there is a tension there. And some of the discussions I certainly had was with police authorities who said, "Look, you should just hand it all over to us, and then we should do the investigation." And there, and from a sort of ethic or constitutional point of view, that seems to make sense. There are two challenges to that. I mean, one is just volume. Most police forces would not be equipped to deal with that. And the second, and this is a sort of harder one to get at, though, is just the consequences of doing that will be much, much more serious for a lot of people. And to take a slightly different example, again, this is very contentious, but I'll go there. There was a case, so when I was at Facebook, and it made the press, so it's not private, where there'd been the circulation of underage sexual images by a group of teenagers in Denmark, I think it was. And they circulated the images. They shouldn't have done that. They were found on the platform, like large numbers, tens of kids in the school. The police insisted they were handed over. The police then go through the normal criminal procedure. All of those children now have a criminal record, which is quite serious. It potentially prevents them working with children, prevents them from entering into certain jobs. Again, very difficult question, but would it have been better? Is it better if those are punished under terms of service of a platform, except in, more serious cases? And again, who defines that? Or is it better all these things are handed over to the police? And there's another discussion we need to have, which is, as certain forms of activity proliferate online. I know this is one that's debated a lot, this sort of sexting, but where it is apparently consensual between groups of, say, 14, 15-year-olds. Let's be clear, there's a whole spectrum there. Is that something that you always want to go to the police and have a criminal track, or is it something that you want, online services to clean up and get rid of and sort of deal with? Very, very difficult area, and there are a number like that. So I again, one level seems obvious, hand everything over to the authorities. Another level is be careful what you wish for, because the outcome of that may not be exactly what was expected or hoped for.
I think it's important to remember, and it's a trivial fact, but none of these systems in social media or elsewhere were designed to produce evidence. They don't have the auditing, they don't have the way of determining that nothing was tampered with, they don't have any of that, which means that you're relying on a system that was designed for something completely different to then produce evidence in court cases that could have very far-reaching conclusions for those involved. And so I think that there's reason to think through this, but my bet would be that in 10 years' time, there will be much more proactive policing privatized throughout the different platforms than we have today. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's happening today. So you're right, the systems are designed for two things. I think one is prevention, and the other is sort of cleaning up the platform. So they're designed, the focus is, look, on other users. So the reason you don't want somebody posting terrorist content or sexualized content on the platform primarily is because that sexualized and terrorist content is going to be problematic for the community of users. And that's why they're called things like community standards. I mean, that's where it started from is, these are the acceptable rules of our community, and this is a set of content that we think is going to be problematic for the community. And so your system is designed to identify and get rid of it, not prosecute, not follow up. Sometimes, depending on the severity, you kick the user off the platform. You say, we don't want you anymore. You're too upsetting for our community. But no, it isn't. It isn't for retribution. Now, platforms have adapted, and actually, again, one of the tensions there's often been between platforms and law enforcement is exactly what is the trigger for notifying law enforcement. So, again, I was involved in a case where, after a terrorist attack, the Facebook that I worked for at the time sort of went through, and again, it's public knowledge. We went and did due diligence to say, okay, we've got some information about the attackers. What were they sharing with each other? We found messages. We handed the messages over to the law enforcement authorities, thinking that was the right thing to do. And actually the response was, well, why the hell hadn't you scanned for these and found them before? And actually we ended up being heavily criticized. I mean, we could have said nothing. Like it could have been like, nothing done, but we thought the right thing was to provide that intelligence and to say what came back was a lot of criticism to say you should have done proactive scanning. Again, incentivizing you to say, well, next time I'll just keep quiet. I'll just kick them off and keep quiet. But so these questions of what are the right thresholds, exactly how bad does somebody have to be? If it's a 19-year-old making sexual propositions to a 14-year-old, is that one that you refer to the police, or is it only when it's a 25-year-old, or is it only when they arrange to meet them? If they're just exchanging, sexy talk, is that okay? There's all sorts of threshold questions. And again, personally, I would much rather have those out in the open. I'd much rather, as a user of the services, I know that. And this is where I do see the regulatory framework, the Digital Services Act or the Online Harms Act in the UK. This is where they could be really helpful if they're done right, because we would have a document agreed between regulators and platforms which spells this stuff out. There'd be a bit of operational stuff you don't want to expose, but I think that, we can't tell you what we're doing because it'll tip people off. I think that's overstated. But in general terms, I think we said, look, this is how we're dealing with grooming. We have a protocol, and our protocol is if we see these general triggers, we're going to hand over to law enforcement. If we see these other kind of behaviors, we're just going to kick them off the platform. This is when sexting turns into a criminal reporting issue. And if we do, this is how we record it as evidence in order to provide blah, blah, blah. And let's get all that written down so that it's not mysterious. Certainly it should be between the regulator and the platforms. And I say, from my point of view, wherever possible, it should also be made public. But sometimes it won't be able to be, and then the regulator of the platform can do
but it could also be audited by human rights organizations, even without making it public.
Exactly.
We have the Global Network Initiative model that does exactly that. And so I think that there's great value in that. But I do think that the prediction holds. In 5 to 10 years, you will see a lot more of this being sort of an integrated policing solution with the platforms as a first line of an early warning function, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's the only way you can deal with it at the scale we're talking about. It's literally the only way you can deal with it. And I often thought so. Again, one of my frustrations sometimes is when we're in the regulatory debate, it's the sort of policymakers going to war with the platforms, and I kind of understand the frustration that drives people to take that view. But it's ignoring the reality that the only way that this can be dealt with is through cooperation.
Oh, and the other thing that it ignores that really irks me is that they seem to assume that platforms don't have good intentions here. And I haven't met a single person when working at Google or in YouTube that did not want to make sure that kids were safe online. And I think that's another thing that we need to sort of set straight, this notion that platforms don't care about kids' safety, because, you can certainly accuse me of being biased in all kinds of ways, but I think that we often start off on the wrong foot, assuming that there's not a common concern. And I think that also leads us astray in the debate. And it's one of the things I liked saying first when we had these discussions and we were invited to all of these meetings, both you and I, was to sort of just set that out. I have a lot of engineers and people actively thinking about this, wanting to do the right thing. Now let's help them do that and not set up, age limits or other weird signal legislation that doesn't create the right incentives for either side.
Yeah, but I think that partly that comes back to what I described earlier, which is when our critics of the model as a whole, in which case their starting point is, well, your services are bad for kids, they're bad for people, and they're bad for kids, and therefore whatever good you're doing to kind of ameliorate them, that's not okay. It's never going to be enough. And then there are others who don't have a problem with your service and are much more willing to accept that, just as you describe, within all the things that a service does, this is one of the things that's taken most seriously.
But that seems to me to argue for something really interesting, which is that if this is the case, we should at the outset state our shared assumptions as a society when we debate the online harms legislation or we debate the DSA. We should try to make sure that at that point, when we do that, we have shared assumptions. And we should debate if one of those shared assumptions is the social media platform, search, all kinds of different internet services are a net benefit to society if regulated in the right way. Because if you don't agree to that assumption, there's a completely different discussion to be had, and then you will never ever end up with something meaningful on the discussion of the Online Harms Act or the DSA.
Exactly, and I think it's really critical to understand this. I saw the reaction when Facebook launched Messenger Kids, and now recently I think they've launched an Instagram sort of targeted at younger audiences, and the reaction from a lot of people was outrageous. You should not have done that because you're just trying to lure your kids in to become part of your surveillance capitalism machine later on. And so, like, if that's your assumption, if you're saying like a service like Facebook, Instagram, Google, TikTok, whatever it is, can never make a service that's okay for kids. Yeah, we're starting from a completely different assumption from those people who are saying, well, these services are legitimate, fine if properly regulated, and they can be made safe for kids. And therefore, we're going to applaud, the efforts of an Instagram or a Facebook who have listened to us and decided to kind of create a customized version with all the right safety features.
So that's a pro tip to our old colleagues then, to try to actually get the assumptions out there if possible. I actually think that would be a really helpful thing to do, to sort of see if there's a shared set of assumptions that we can start arguing from, because then we can get to this point where there's one of my favorite political philosophers, Charles Larmore, has this term that everyone that I've talked to recently will be bored to death with because I've been plaguing them with it, and it's the term reasonable disagreement. And he has this notion that there's such a thing as reasonable disagreement, where you share a number of assumptions, but you might have arrived at the current situation from different paths, which means that you weight and value things differently, but you can still have a reasonable disagreement about how to do things in the right way. And the contrary to that then is when you share no assumptions and you have absolutely no common ground, and your disagreement will not have any of the reasonable characteristics that he points out. And I think a lot of the disagreements we're having about online child safety are really not reasonable disagreements, to my sense.
I'd add another phrase, which is existential disagreement, which is I disagree with your right to exist. and and again, we should be really candid. Some people really, that's fine. That's they're entitled to that viewpoint. They do not like large, particularly American internet giants. They do not think they should exist, and they're very candid about it. And they look at 20 different ways in which they could be got rid of, and they look at regulation to get rid of them. And if that's your starting point, you're going to apply that lens to every aspect of it, and that does mean you're going to say, look, Facebook can never be okay for kids. They can, whatever they do, it will never be okay because Facebook's not okay. I disagree with their existence, and I say that's fine, but let's have the debate on those terms. And then there'll be a group of other people who say, really, what I'm looking for in the regulation is to improve Facebook and make it better. And they will come at it very differently, and there'll be a point at which they say, "You've done enough. You've done enough. I'm really happy now." And I think you and I are certainly in that latter camp. I mean, it's for obvious reasons, but I'm definitely in that. Again, just as somebody who watches what's going on here, I would feel much more comfortable with my children using services that are run by American internet giants, because I know they have these really good people, than services that are run by unknowns for unknown purposes and unknown reasons, and who are really unaccountable. There are some very good services for kids. It's not to discount those that are specialist and dedicated, and that's fine. But in the sort of entire universe of apps that are available in an app store, the ones that come from the major internet companies, I think, are backed up by serious engineers with great expertise and brilliant systems that are working away in the background. And everything I've said about, it's scary for internet companies to, identify younger users explicitly because they run into legal problems. You know what the engineers are frustrated that they can't do more. Like, that's the kind of engineers I want, who are like, can't you remove this legal barrier? Because look, if you let me flag all the 11-year-olds as 11-year-olds, there is so much more I could do to keep them safe.
Yeah.
And I suspect in some cases they're doing that and taking a legal risk because it's the right legal risk to take in the name of safety.
Yes, very much agreed. And I think, actually, paradoxically, the people who have, as you say, and I like the term, an existential disagreement with the internet, or with internet platforms, or with American internet platforms, are actually holding this debate back. Because what happens is that they find no solution good enough, which means that they keep opening the debate again and again and again, so we never get forward, which means that they are, if you really wanted to sort of be harsh and take this to its extreme, you can say that that's actually creating a risk for kids online over time, one that accumulates and becomes bigger and bigger, because they're not seeking actual solutions, but they're seeking ways in which to negate the right to exist, to your point. And that seems to be less productive.
I mean, there's a tension against some of it, and I've been involved in politics, and you need the extremes in politics sometimes to sort of drive things forward. And I say a lot of the people who work in this space are really good. The fact they're so passionate and single-minded, they're keeping something on the agenda that would otherwise slip off the agenda, and we should recognize that and respect it. But some of the solutions they propose may not be the best solutions. Because we're going to end up, again, like in politics, you often don't want the solutions at the extremes. You want the extremes to keep driving the debate, but the solution will end up being something a little bit more sort of balanced, where various other things come into account.
I think my point is that as long as you have a solution, it's fine. When you don't, that's when I feel you're stopping the debate, because anyone who brings a solution to the debate is welcome, and those solutions may well be at the extremes, but it's the people who never even bring the solutions that I think are holding the debate back.
That's right. So let's go back. Honest age in Android and iOS. That is the solution that I'd like to leave us with this week. If anyone wants to challenge that and come up with a better one, that's great. But I just think, over time, when the phone is honestly telling every internet service that the person's interacting with the honest age of the kid, that gives us the starting point. And the service can accept that without creating, sort of incurring massive legal liability, but can accept it and respond to it appropriately. We're getting somewhere.
And on top of that, you would also have the sort of agreement between platforms, regulators, and the general public on where you proactively monitor and what kinds of flags you set up and how you secure the evidentiary value of those flags in different ways, which would create a collaborative environment.
Exactly. Those are the harm reduction plans. That it literally is a document that I think should exist as almost a contract between the regulator and each platform, saying we've identified the harms, this is what we're doing to reduce them, and that, as I say, big chunks of it in the public domain, and other parts, as you rightly pointed out, subject to audit and inspection and other things, so that we, the public, can be confident. And that will be really good for us when we want to choose to use different internet services, that we can see that, and that our regulators, on our behalf as citizens, have sort of put these documents out there that allow us to make value judgments about different internet services and what they're doing.
That's excellent. So we solve this. Why doesn't anyone put us in charge of it? This is very strange, I think, when we have all of the solutions. So thank you for that. Yes. I am sure that people will happily point out to us, and we really like it, by the way, when people point out to us that we're wrong. So don't hesitate to come back and let us know we're wrong. That discussion is our first discussion. I'm sure we'll get back to the subject, but this concludes our 18th episode of Regulate Tech that can be found on your website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to have you with us next week.